The historic summit in Singapore between the United States and North Korea ushered in what many considered a new era of international diplomacy. President Trump claimed that in his meeting with dictator Kim Jong-un, a path to denuclearization was nothing short of guaranteed. It was a major shift in tone for the president, who once swore fire and fury on the country if they didn't back down from their nuclear weapons development. Since the summit, the White House has touted success of halting North Korea's nuclear program. But in a report from the New York Times, satellite images suggest the regime's missile program is very much alive. It mapped out more than a dozen hidden bases known to American intelligence agencies. To break down the report and the nuclear threats that may still linger, I spoke with Harry Kazianis. He's the Director of Defense Studies at the Center for the National Interest. We also spoke about how tangible denuclearization is months after the summit. Harry, thank you so much for joining us. You know, you really pushed back after that New York Times article came out saying the United States was being deceived regarding revelations over Pyongyang's missile program. You say this was the furthest thing from a deception. So what was it then?
Well, the problem I had was the headline, to be honest with you. The article was great. There was a lot of good information there detailing how far North Korea has built up its missiles and probably its nuclear weapons program. The challenge is that information, we might not have known exactly where the bases were, how big they are, but that information was pretty much widely known in the North Korean community. So to go on record and say that it was a deception or to imply that somehow President Trump was being deceived, I think, to be honest with you, it isn't a stretch to even call it fake news.
Right.
It's really, the problem is the headline. The information is accurate, but the headline is very inflammatory and not something we need when we're actually trying to negotiate with North Korea and come up with some sort of peace framework.
So I guess the point you're making is that there was never an agreement to stop the development of these missiles and operation facilities. So what then was negotiated in our agreement with North Korea during that summit in Singapore?
Well, really a new beginning, to be honest with you. I think both sides understood that we cannot go back to the days of fire and fury last year in 2017. I think if you read the Bob Woodward book, for example, you understand how close we came literally to the brink of nuclear war. And if that had happened, millions of people would have died. So I think there was a rationale on both sides that the rhetoric had gotten too hot, the threats had gotten too hot, and I think for both sides there was a recognition that they at least need to start talking. The challenge is now is those talks have basically broken down really because of one thing. Who gives the biggest concession first? Neither side right now wants to give the big concession. The North Koreans are looking for some sort of peace treaty ending the Korean War. The United States wants the North Koreans to give up their nuclear weapons before it gives anything. So right now, we're essentially at a crossroads.
So you're saying that since the summit between President Trump and Kim Jong-un, negotiations with Pyongyang have halted. Now, this is despite the White House's repeated touts of success. You know, as you point out, it's been almost 6 months since that historic meeting. Where exactly are relations with the regime now? And would you say they are better or worse than last year?
Well, anything's better than threatening nuclear war. I mean, I think that's pretty obvious. I mean, we don't have a situation where the North Koreans are testing long-range missiles that could hit the United States. They're not testing nuclear weapons anymore. It was those optics, it was those pictures that really drove the crisis. Because when you can see those pictures in front of you and what those weapons could potentially do, that's terrifying. And that's what I think really drove this. So that's not happening anymore, which is a good thing. But now we have to figure out how we're going to solve the situation. Is North Korea really willing to give up the ultimate weapon that can deter the United States? Is the United States willing to give major concessions? For example, dropping sanctions. Is either side really willing to budge? And right now, it seems like talks are essentially stuck in neutral until somebody will make the first move. And if nobody's willing to make a move, we could end up back in a situation in 2017 on the brink of war. Well, and that would be a tragedy.
I do want to point out, because for The Hill, you penned an op-ed where you say that we are on an alarming path to war with North Korea. What are the signs that you see that we are perhaps headed along that path?
Well, the North Koreans are actually very good at telling us how they feel, what's going to happen next. They telegraph a lot of their moves, to be honest with you. And there's been a number of different op-eds, statements that have come out of North Korean press that have really shown their anger at the United States. In some respects, they feel duped by the Trump administration. There's been different statements come from them that have said that Donald Trump had promised them some sort of peace declaration to end the Korean War. Obviously, that hasn't happened. And the United States feels deceived in some respects, too. They felt as if the North Koreans were going to give more in terms of giving some sort of nuclear dossier, maybe giving up some nuclear weapons as a show of good faith. So both sides essentially feel like they have been deceived. And when that happens, that's when negotiations break down. And that's why we could be headed for some trouble going into next year.
So if we do see a full breakdown with negotiations with Pyongyang, is it likely that we will see the president amp up his rhetoric, putting all options on the table again? The White House has said they've already put maximum economic pressure on the regime. So what options are on the table exactly?
Well, for the United States, there's really no good options at this point. The actual maximum pressure campaign is starting to break down. The Chinese, the Russians, they're really starting to scrap this whole program. And the Chinese are doing it for one specific reason. They're not going to follow the United States' lead when it comes to North Korea when you're in a trade war where the United States is slapping Beijing with billions of dollars in tariffs. So China really has no incentive to really follow
China has no
along.
incentive to follow the U.S. on anything, not just North Korea.
Exactly.
I'm just wondering, what is the nightmare scenario, though, you think is within the realm of possibility?
I think the nightmare is this. The North Koreans start testing ICBMs again. Now, we know these missiles are not 100% reliable. Years ago, they had a lot of problems, and this is actually one of the reasons why many of us, including myself, never thought they'd get this far. But suppose they do test another ICBM. Let's say, God forbid, that missile crash lands in South Korea or Japan or even on the outskirts of Guam. That could actually necessitate a U.S. military response or South Korean or even Japanese military response. In a situation like that, the North Koreans do not have the intelligence assets to know if that would be a full-blown attack or just a one-off. That could actually make the North Koreans launch a nuclear strike. That's how fast it could unravel.
That is really terrifying. What a scenario. Now, Harry, what then would you personally advise the Trump administration? I mean, if denuclearization doesn't seem to be in sight, what can then be done to hinder Pyongyang's nuclear ambitions?
Well, I think we have to take a step back and realize that the United States has always dealt with countries that we don't like that have nuclear weapons. I mean, China and Russia are the greatest examples. We have huge problems with both countries, but we don't refuse to negotiate with them because they have these weapons. So I think we have to recognize that. I still think there is a path forward where North Korea could denuclearize. I think what President Trump needs to do is offer a peace treaty to North Korea. I mean, there's no shooting war happening on the Korean Peninsula. I mean, my father-in-law, who passed away recently at 88 years old, fought in the Korean War. That war is over. So I think if we offer that, we test the North Koreans' intentions, and that should elicit them to make a step in the right direction. If they won't after that point, I think we know the jig is up.
So you're saying we should offer them an olive branch?
Absolutely. There's no reason not to. Because you remember, think of it like this. If we offer them a piece of paper and they hand us some plutonium, in other words, getting rid of their nuclear program, I think that's a smart move, and I think that's a good trade on our part.
All right. Harry Kazianis, thank you so much for sharing your insight on this topic with us.
Thanks for having me.
After the break, we'll take a deeper look at life inside North Korea through the eyes of a reporter. Our Ben Tracy tells us about the tales of his travels inside Pyongyang. You're streaming CBSN Originals. We'll be right back.